if you spent time on this campus, you would encounter a lot of recollections of President Nixon at Whittier College, and you would see gifts that he has made, he and Pat Nixon made to the library. And if you go on tours of the library, you would see a fountain and a monument dedicated to Richard Nixon as a leader. And you would have opportunity to learn about his connection to the college even after he left and graduated. While he was Vice President of the United States, he was still serving on the board of Whittier College. And in 1954, he delivered a televised commencement address to the graduates. And he said, and I will quote to you, "I'm glad that I went to Whittier College because at Whittier, education means more than just learning how to make a good living. The Whittier student is also taught the importance of worthwhile living. I think you will agree with me that no student can attend Whittier College without acquiring a sense of social and community responsibility." Well, much has changed since Richard Nixon graduated from Whittier College. In fact, tuition is a little higher than the $250 that Richard Nixon spent on his tuition when he was here. But much remains the same. We are still a college that is devoted to liberal learning, to educating students to have a breadth of understanding of the world, to respect people of all backgrounds, and to provide service to communities wherever they are, whether here or abroad. And we think that one of our graduates who understood that commitment to understanding people from around the world and to service is obviously President Richard M. Nixon. We continue with his legacy today in our Center for Engagement with Communities, a center which was created a few years ago to develop even further and expand upon the work that Joyce Kaufman, professor of political science, had started with her College and Community program, which connects Whittier students with partners in the community to do research projects, for service learning, that classes can take students out and to engage in learning projects, and for students to learn through applied experiences within the community. The event tonight is sponsored by the Center for Engagement with Communities, and we are thrilled to have so many people from the community here, and we hope that you will come back often to experience the wonderful education that our students have opportunities to enjoy. So with that, I would like to turn the mic over to Sandy Quinn and from the Nixon Foundation and invite him to say a few words. And then after that, Joyce Kaufman will come up and introduce our tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Sharon. Very briefly, I'm president of the Richard Nixon Foundation in Yorba Linda, and we, of course, through the man whose name is on our door, have had decades and decades of relationship with Whittier College, and also are proud that we share two or three people with the school. One of them is our good friend Hubert Perry, who's sitting in the front row, and was sitting on the bench with Richard Nixon when he played here in the 30s. Well, not really played, I guess, Hubert. I guess the two of you just sat on the bench, but I'm not sure of that. But at any rate, we have the bench. And then next year is the Richard Nixon Centennial Year, 2013. And on February 15th, we open the Richard Nixon Centennial exhibit. And a feature of that exhibit is that bench from Whittier College, where on which Hubert and the 37th president probably complained about not being in the starting lineup. But we also share Ruth Shannon, because Ruth has been a good friend of ours for many, many years. She was a participant in the very beginning of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, which is now, of course, in Yorba Linda. And she's a good supporter and participant with us now. Thank you, Ruth. We have an excellent relationship, I think, with Sharon. And we're proud of that. And we're proud of the idea of doing things together. We had an intern with us, I think 3 years ago, the Nixon Scholar here, and a bright young man who we met on a visit here, and he was doing studies on healthcare. And his paper that year was the innovations that Richard Nixon had come up with as president, and he thought they were so visionary that he wrote a paper on it. So we brought him in as intern. And we were doing a conference in Washington, and Henry Kissinger was the luncheon speaker. And he came back to that conference. Sharon wanted to invite Dr. Kissinger to Whittier College, and wrote a personal letter and commissioned Alex to present it to Dr. Kissinger. So we're standing in near the podium, and we see Dr. Kissinger walking in and heading towards the table one. So I took him over and I said, Alex, is going to be very quick. You just hand him the letter and say hello, and that's probably going to be it. And the next thing I knew, he and Dr. Kissinger were chatting, and I'm ignored, of course, and the two of them became good friends, and he presented the letter, and we got a picture of him, and I think it was in the school newspaper. But we have much to do together, and I look forward to doing it. Thank you, Sharon, for letting us be part of this tonight. Our good friend, Dr. Solomon, we have worked with for years and years. He worked with President Nixon. He helped open China. He'll tell you all about that. But we've done things together in Washington, and we'll look forward to doing more with him as well as with Sharon. Thank you.
Good evening. Before I introduce, I'm Joyce Kaufman. I'm director of the Center for Engagement with Communities, which Sharon referred to, and I'm a professor of political science. Before I introduce Ambassador Solomon, I want to say a few words of thanks to all the people who helped make the events this week run so smoothly. To Kristen Weiberg, Special Assistant to the President, who was our liaison with the Nixon Foundation, but who was a source of important ideas and suggestions. To the Nixon Foundation for their help with this event. From the Center for Engagement with Communities, David Sarabia, Patricia Pent, Valerie, and Marilyn Chavez, who were invaluable as well as calm in the face of what seemed to be organized chaos at times. And special thanks to the BCM Foundation, which provided the funding to the CEC to help sponsor this event. And in fact, Ambassador Solomon's visit. Ambassador Solomon is our second center fellow and is setting a very high bar for whomever follows next year, I have to say. I first became acquainted with and began working with the United States Institute of Peace almost 25 years ago, when I wrote a proposal to the organization to support a new program that I was starting here at Whittier College on international negotiation. The program was designed to use what was then new internet technology, think about that for a minute, to link high schools on the West Coast with Whittier College in a simulation of international negotiation that was conducted online. Students represented different countries. Whittier College students represented the United States, and they negotiated on important international issues, culminating in a face-to-face summit here at Whittier College. We were fortunate enough to have received one of USIP's first education grants, and we put that program into place. I'm pleased to say that that program remains in place, and next week we'll be starting our 23rd simulation, so the 23rd year of that program. Some of the teachers who are involved in the program are actually in the audience. Could you sort of recognize Steve? Come on. Yeah, he's been a part of this from the beginning. And Sean, you're here. So we have a couple of teachers. And I do want to say that over the years we've run this simulation, literally thousands of students have been affected by the experience, some of whom have themselves gone on to become diplomats, foreign service officers, and negotiators of various kinds. Although Ambassador Solomon was not then president of USIP, I strongly encourage you to take credit for that terrific program. Now, I know you didn't come to hear us, so I'm going to turn to our speaker. I don't think he needs much in the way of an introduction. He was president of the United States Institute since 1993. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He served as Director of Policy Planning at the United States Department of State, and from 1971 to 76 was a senior member of the National Security Council, in which he participated in the process of normalizing U.S. relations with China. He earned an honorary degree from Whittier College on Monday evening, and as I noted in my remarks at that time when I introduced him, his distinguished career literally has changed the course of international relations and, by extension, altered history in our country and the world. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Richard Solomon.
Good evening, and thanks so much for coming. As a recently former president, I want to thank two currently serving presidents, Sharon Hertzberger, president of Whittier, of course, and President Sandy Quinn, who's the president of the Nixon Foundation. It's truly an honor to have had this very full, very busy week here. Terrific honor to have been honored with an honorary doctorate, and for both my wife Anne, who's with us and who played an equally active role in developing relations with China, the fact to switch gears after the 19 years I was at the Institute of Peace, to take a deep breath and be rejuvenated by the wonderful student body here was truly a treat, and we're deeply grateful for you, Sharon, and for Joyce Kaufman. Our links with Whittier include my son-in-law, Randall Davidson, who's with us. He's a graduate of the class of 1988, and so we have many reasons to feel very, very blessed by our opportunity to be with you this week. I was asked to talk about one of the most dramatic developments in our foreign relations, that was the work of our 37th president, Richard Nixon. And I had the good fortune to play a supporting role in the president's initiative to open relations with the People's Republic of China, Red China as we called it at that time. And his initiative was one of the truly most significant departures, initiatives in American foreign policy for reasons that I'll detail for you in a few minutes. But what I'm going to try to do is describe in retrospect the significance of that development. My bottom line, I'm going to start out with my punchline, is that today the management of our relations with China is one of the major strategic initiatives and challenges of American foreign policy. That's looking back 40 years and being aware of all that's going on in our relations with China today. At the time that President Nixon announced on July 15th, 1971, that he had sent Henry Kissinger secretly to China, that initiative was a transformative event in the Cold War to the benefit of both the United States and China. It created the conditions for real pressure on the Soviet Union, which President Nixon saw as correctly as our major security threat, and it did create the conditions for China of its dramatic economic takeoff. And again, we'll talk a bit more about what has happened over the 40 years since then that has made China to the second largest economy of the world and a very challenging competitor, certainly in the economic realm. What's so evident looking back over this period in history is that President Nixon, in many ways, was our last president with a strong strategic sense. As was mentioned, he had been vice president for President Eisenhower, and in that role had traveled all around the world. He knew leaders in every continent, and like President Eisenhower, he had a strong sense of the challenges of dealing with a two-front challenge. Of course, President Eisenhower, in his military role during World War II, had to fight a two-front war against the Nazis in Europe, against the Japanese in Asia. So President Nixon acquired, I think, from President Eisenhower a sense of the complexity of dealing with a two-front challenge to America's security. And that, of course, was the character of the conflict during the Cold War, where we were facing, after 1950, an alliance between the Soviet Union and China. That was an alliance that led us into some very challenging military conflicts, the war in Korea, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then later the Vietnam War. And without going through the whole history of President Nixon's experience, let me start in the mid to late 1960s when Citizen Nixon was looking forward to a presidential bid. At that time, Mr. Nixon was well aware that the Vietnam War had basically destroyed the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, that the burdens of that conflict, the loss of American lives, over 57,000 Americans killed, was politically tearing the country apart and led to President Johnson announcing that he would not run for a second term. And during those years, Mr. Nixon said that he was developing a secret plan, as he put it at the time, to end the war in Vietnam. Now, I can remember teaching at the University of Michigan in the latter part of the 1960s when Mr. Nixon talked about having a secret plan, which we say it generated a certain element of skepticism. But for those who were paying attention, the president-to-be, having completed a tour of Asia in the early months of 1967, wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine called Asia After Vietnam. And the word after is really critical because it demonstrates that Mr. Nixon, as he approached the campaign of 1968, didn't want his time to be undermined by this burden of the Vietnam conflict, because he was looking at that situation in a much broader strategic framework. And it's clear in retrospect that he was already thinking about approaching the Chinese to see if it would be a way of, in effect, leapfrogging out of the Vietnam quagmire and dealing with the fundamental threats to American security, which were the challenges from both the Soviet Union and China. Now, Mr. Nixon's vision was not only insightful, but it was highly risky. In those days, the idea of approaching Red China, Communist China, was, to say the least, very controversial. But Mr. Nixon, in his earlier political life, had made it clear that opposition to communism was a very important part of his approach to politics. And as it turned out, when he did engage the Chinese, he was, if you like, protected against the attack that he might have been soft on communism. This was a risky initiative, not only in terms of his political standing, but his judgment that China could be split from its ally, the Soviet Union. There were early signs, actually beginning in the early 1960s, that China's leader, Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, and the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, did not get along. There was a lot of hostility there, and when I was a graduate student, we started reading ideological polemics that were being published in the Soviet and the Chinese press, where the two countries were attacking each other obliquely through these rather esoteric Marxist debates that indicated they were diverging in a very significant way in terms of policy. And we didn't see very clearly at the time how much that debate was driven by personal animosity between Chairman Mao and Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, of course, fell from power because, in part of his what Mao called the harebrained scheme of sending missiles into Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended up, fortunately, President Kennedy had managed our dealing with that in a way that did not lead to a military conflict. And Khrushchev, 2 years later, fell from power. But under the Brezhnev leadership, the Soviet Union continued to be a very aggressive and threatening power. After Mr. Nixon had published his 1967 article, the next year the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, 1968. And leader of that time, Leonid Brezhnev, announced a policy of limited sovereignty for states that were in the so-called socialist camp. So the Chinese, seeing that happening and seeing a military buildup on their northern frontier, concluded, well, the Soviets are a tremendous threat to our security, and we better find a way to deal with it. So in that sense, the ground was laid for the realization of Mr. Nixon's insight that the differences between the Soviet Union and China could lead to an initiative on our part. That said, anyone paying attention to China had to conclude that there was such hostility to the United States that the idea that the two countries could come together in some way was almost unbelievable. China was in the throes of what is called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It was an internal political struggle, and the outside world, the capitalist world, was the target of much of the attack, and the United States was criticized roundly day by day in the Chinese press for its involvement, in particular, in the Vietnam conflict. So how should the United States deal with this situation? We have serious security threats from both the Soviet Union and China, but they're starting to fight among themselves. Now, one point of view that was floating around the government was to use a Chinese phrase, let's just sit on the mountaintop and watch the tigers fight. That is, let the two communist powers fight among themselves. Why should we get in the middle of it all? But Mr. Nixon and President Nixon had a different approach. He concluded that the Chinese were not fundamentally a threat to the United States. As he repeatedly said during his tenure in office, there are no fundamental strategic conflicts of interest between the two countries. But he did see, of course, the threat from the Soviet Union. So his insight and his risk was approaching the Chinese to see whether they would join together with us to counter the Soviet threat. And that was really his secret plan. He really did have this as a concept, and because of the atmosphere of the time, the evident Chinese hostility to the United States, he didn't talk about it openly. He hinted at it in this 1967 article, but it was a secret plan. So how did he go about initiating this plan? How did he make it a reality? During the summer of 1971, I was teaching at the University of Michigan, a summer course because I was taking a year's leave in the fall to join Henry Kissinger's National Security Council staff. And on July 15th, I was having dinner with some friends, and they said, "Oh, Mr. Nixon's going to give a speech tonight." And I said, "Oh, more about the Vietnam War. I'm up to here with it. I really don't think we need to watch it." No. Let's watch the speech. And of course, that was the surprise announcement that really changed the dynamic of the Cold War. When President Nixon announced that he'd already sent Henry Kissinger on a secret mission to China to lay the basis for his own visit and for normalizing relations. Now, there was only one thing that President Nixon did not announce on that evening, July 15th, and that was that my wife, Anne, had already been to China for an unofficial meeting with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese Prime Minister, who talked to her and some others from the journalistic community to get into our mass media China's view of how they would deal with the Taiwan situation. But it's only one way that Anne has been a contributor to the normalization of relations with China. President Nixon's visit was without question a shock. It was also, you can almost hear a sigh of relief, because there was tremendous anxiety in this country that we could be drawn into another war with China, as we had in the case of Korea, over the Vietnam conflict. And so the idea that we could somehow improve relations with Vietnam was welcomed with unbelievable a positive reaction in our country. It was a tremendous shock, of course, to the Russians, to the Soviet Union, who suddenly saw that the United States was going to be dealing with what had become their arch enemy. So that the positive reaction that President Nixon gained from the Chinese leadership, specifically from Mao Zedong, realigned the strategic balance in world politics at that time. The Soviets were put on the defensive, and there was fear that they might become unbelievably hostile to us for this maneuver. In fact, the Soviet leadership started making nice to us, and in effect started trying to outbid the Chinese for good relations with the United States. So President Nixon's initiative really was a double whammy. It led to several very significant early arms control agreements, but it did put the Soviet Union, the Brezhnev leadership, back on its heels. So President Nixon's secret plan, which in its public phase was his effort to create peace with honor, enabled the United States to disengage from Vietnam, It took several years, considerable additional loss of life, and it was an unfortunate disengagement from an Allied government. But President Nixon was playing for the big game, which was the threat from the Soviet Union. Now, his very successful trip to Beijing in February of 1972 has to be one of the not only great diplomatic initiatives in our diplomatic history, but it, in terms of building public support for what was totally unexpected development, was a first in terms of the use of television. And President Nixon's trip really was a media event. And Sandy Quinn's colleagues, Ronald Walker, who was President Nixon's advance man, and others did an unbelievable job of taking a country that had no television infrastructure, didn't even have an air traffic control system for all the airplanes that we were about to send into China with all sorts of equipment, in fact led to a television event that, again, built public support in our country and elsewhere around the world for this change in our policy. And I think we all probably remember, those of you with a little white hair to be sure, having breakfast, sitting around the breakfast table in that February period, watching President Nixon having, because of the 12-hour time shift, having toast with Premier Zhou Enlai, visiting the great historic sites, the Great Wall of China, the Ming tombs, the Forbidden City, in which the Chinese used their cultural heritage to try to convince the world that they weren't the crazy Red Guards that had been terrorizing the Chinese political system for 7 or 8 years. Following the Nixon visit, the process of normalizing relations, that is, moving away from the confrontation that had burdened this relationship since the Korean War, went through several phases, and they're worth noting about. President Nixon, as you know, resigned in 1974, having told Chairman Mao that he intended to establish diplomatic relations in his second term. So, unfortunately, he was not able to fully realize the fruits of his dramatic initiative. And shortly after his visit, the internal politics in China worked against an improvement in relations. As Chairman Mao's health declined, he ended up dying in 1976. A radical group in the Chinese leadership around Chairman Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, known as the Gang of Four, terrorized the political process and slowed down the effort to normalize relations. Fortunately, there were elements in the Chinese leadership who supported the Mao-Nixon initiative, and so shortly after Chairman Mao died, within a month or so, this radical group was purged, and the basis was led for the emergence of a new generation of leadership around a man who I think you've heard of, Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping consolidated his leadership in 1979, and his policy was to do something that was totally unthinkable during the Mao period, to end the high level of politicization of Chinese politics and to open up the country to the world. And again, Anne played a major role in that process. She was in China working out of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and in the summer of 1978, she was with a delegation in which Deng Xiaoping said he wanted to start sending students to the United States, which was absolutely unheard of in a time when there was such hostility within China towards the outside world. So Deng Xiaoping initiates what becomes a golden era in U.S.-China relations during the 1980s. suddenly the country opened up. I, at that time, was at the Rand Corporation and was invited to serve on an editorial group that Deng Xiaoping had blessed. This is 1982, to translate the Encyclopedia Britannica into Chinese. And I made several trips to China and worked with Chinese counterparts translating the Britannica, all 20 volumes of it, into Chinese, which for a country that had gone through its revolutionary phase, its hostility to the outside world, was a truly transformative event. We had to do things like figure out how to translate an article about Stalin. Now, if there's any issue that was very loaded politically, was Stalin a good guy or a bad guy? Well, the mood of the time was such that we could play it straight. That is, we translated the article in the Britannica in English into Chinese without putting any political slant on the translation. And of course, most of the Britannica is not so politically loaded, but I've published 8 books. They have, maybe a few thousand readers, but if you look at the imprint plate on each of those 20 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica into Chinese, there's my name in Chinese. So there are a billion people who just might have looked at the Chinese version of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Big deal, big deal. But during the 1980s, this openness did play itself out and started China on the road to its phenomenal economic development. So the 80s was a terrific time for those of us who were so relieved to see that we weren't going to end up in a big fight with China, but more than that, had the opportunity to try to develop a positive relationship and realize all the fruits of President Nixon's initiative. And then comes 1989. 1989, you can say, is either the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end. It was the end of the beginning at Tiananmen Square, and I think, again, most of you have heard about what happened at Tiananmen in the spring of 1989. Precisely as a result of Deng Xiaoping's having opened up the country, you had a younger generation that took it seriously. They wanted intellectual openness, they wanted political openness, and they were very unhappy with signs of corruption as a result of this one-party dictatorship. And so they were calling for democracy, and they got out there in the big celebratory square right opposite the Forbidden City, calling for an end to the Communist Party's one-party rule. That event led to a split within the Chinese leadership, and the man who was at that point the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, a man named Zhao Ziyang, a man with liberal, accommodating views, he didn't want to crush the students. He didn't want to use military force. Unfortunately, another element in the leadership, supported by Deng Xiaoping, decided that they could not afford to see the country open up to the point that the students were demanding. And so they, as you know, they sent military forces into Tiananmen and crushed the student rebellion. Several thousand younger people were killed. And I think many of you have seen that iconic image of the man standing in front of the tank, challenging it to run over him. And that event, unfortunately, provoked a very negative reaction, not only within China, but around the world. And that's why I say it was a kind of the end of the beginning of this very positive period of the development of our relations. And what we don't know is whether it was the beginning, the end of our ability of our political system to support a positive relationship with China. As a result of the Tiananmen incident, President Bush 41, under tremendous pressure from Congress, imposed a series of economic and other sanctions on China. And the Chinese, not surprisingly, became very defensive. And out of the reaction to Tiananmen, a mood of mutual distrust emerged that still burdens our relationship, where it's clear the Chinese do not support the kind of political openness that we think is important to any major power managing its own internal affairs. Despite our sanctions, however, the Chinese economy during the 1980s and 90s continued its dramatic takeoff that had begun the decade before under Deng Xiaoping's opening up policy. The Chinese economy has done something that is unprecedented in history. It has grown at roughly 10% a year for at least 3 decades, and now, as I think you all know, China is the second largest economy in the world. And I could give you a number of anecdotes about the absolutely mind-blowing transformations that have occurred in China as a result of that economic takeoff. Not the least is my son-in-law, who I mentioned, was mentioned earlier, Randall Davidson, a graduate of this college, is now engaged in working with Chinese manufacturing units who provide consumer goods for the American market. The economy, again, just has taken off and has put China now in a position with both many upsides but also some downsides, some difficult challenges. Certainly on the upside is the fact that probably 200 million people, there obviously is no firm number of people who had been living impoverished peasant lives, have been lifted out of poverty. But in that process of raising standards of living in parts of the country, particularly along the eastern coastal areas near the export zones, other parts of the country have not moved forward, and so there's substantial internal tension within China over the disparities in modernization and standards of living. Along with this dramatic growth has been concern with the corruption imposed on the society at lower levels, particularly as county or other lower level officials try to appropriate peasant land for the development of industries. And corruption to this day remains a major burden on the Chinese political system. One of the great contradictions or dilemmas that the Chinese leadership faces is that their modernization has required them to become what we might call a wired society. The internet, the use of cell phones, there are estimated over 400 million people in China with cell phones. And just think of the difficulty of maintaining political discipline when you have that many people who can get on the telephone and talk about what's going on, and whether it's the corruption in their local community or what's going on in the world. So that the modernization of the society has led to these very sharp internal tensions, and you have the disparity between a society that has modernized itself to a remarkable degree and a one-party system. So the society has modernized, but the political system has not. And as we're meeting tonight, there is underway in the Chinese capital in Beijing a political transition going forward. And one of the big issues that what is the 5th generation of leaders in China are facing is whether they can modernize, open up their political process to, in effect, match or be appropriate to the way their society has modernized. Randall or I could give you many examples of how the society today is just totally transformed from certainly what I knew, or when Randall was a student in China in the 1980s, was still a rather backward peasant society. Today, China is blessed to have a freeway system that is totally clogged up with cars. And 15 years ago, I said to the Chinese ambassador to Washington, when it was evident they were going to develop an automobile industry, I said, "You're getting yourself into enormous trouble, because the automobile is the sign of real personal liberation. Everybody's going to want an automobile. And then you're going to have the problem of getting enough petroleum, oil, energy, gasoline to power all those cars. And you don't have the infrastructure to support hundreds of million people who want to have automobiles today. And that today is exactly where this country is. And I was recently in Shanghai to give a talk. It's no longer a city that has the flavor of a Chinese environment. There are tremendous modern hotels, apartment blocks, the clogged streets jammed up with those cars, and you could be in almost any city in the world, and you almost wouldn't know you were in China, except you know you're in China when you start talking to people. Another one of the dilemmas that has come out of this modernization drive is the role of the Chinese military in their politics. When Deng Xiaoping opened up the country, the military was still very much in control. And his problem was how to free up the resources that were being spent for defense purposes at a time when they didn't have a confrontation with the United States, and to put those resources into economic development. So Deng Xiaoping, in effect, bought off the military by saying to the leaders and to their children, you can have a preferred place in the economic takeoff that is about to occur. And so the military, for quite a while, had quite a grip on the civilianizing economy. And under Deng Xiaoping's successor, Jiang Zemin, there's been an effort, and subsequently, to get the military out of the economy and back into the barracks. That is, playing the role that militaries normally play in national defense. But even that transformation in their way of dealing with their own security is complicated, because one of the big threats to Communist Party leadership are all those wired people, those hundreds of millions of people who can talk on their cell phones, who read what's going on around the world on the internet. And so the Chinese leadership has built a censoring cadre of, they estimate, over 200,000 people who spend all their time listening to those cell phone conversations or monitoring what's coming in over the internet to make sure that subversive stuff doesn't pop up. If you're in this country, of course, you Google Tiananmen and you'll get lots of accounts of what happened at Tiananmen. If you go into China and you Google Tiananmen, nothing shows up on your machine. And we could give you lots of other examples of where the conversation within China that's facilitated by it having become a modernized, wired society is under the control of this big censoring group of officials. That situation, in my view, is unsustainable. And it's one of the big issues, again, that the leadership is going to be confronting as it moves into its new phase of leadership. Put in other terms, the stability of politics, of the political system in China, has become dependent on continuing economic growth. The deal that the leadership basically struck with the society is, you let us maintain political control and we'll continue to raise your standard of living. That's where that 10% a year growth has made a big difference for politics in China. That pattern, that strategy for developing the society was based on export-led growth. And so the peasants who were coming into the manufacturing zones on the eastern coast were making Barbie dolls and ceramic ware, all sorts of things. As who put it? One of our friends said, they want everybody in the room to take off every piece of clothing that was made in China. Obviously, we're not going to ask you to do it. It would embarrass a lot of people. But the fact is, the Chinese have become a major source of inexpensive consumer goods. Now, that situation is changing. The Chinese people are starting to say, hey, we want a better share of that growth, of that growing pie. And what that's leading to now is pressure to increase wages, to give the Chinese people more purchasing power, and to move from an export-led growth strategy to one that the leadership is staring at, which is a society much like ours, which is based on domestic consumption. And that, again, is one of the big changes that this new leadership is facing. And in ways that I think Deng Xiaoping never anticipated when he called for the country to open up and to develop in this dramatic way, is how much political stability and the economy of China, which is important to that stability, has put China in a position where it is dependent on good relations with the outside world. China needs access to our domestic market. It needs access to our university systems, where it's sending hundreds of thousands of students to be trained mostly in the engineering and science area or in business administration, which of course is going to make them even more competitive with us than they are today. The other downside, if you like, of this modernization effort has been the concern that Zhou Enlai and Mao expressed to President Nixon and Henry Kissinger back in the early 70s, and Deng Xiaoping has also expressed, which is the kind of we and the Chinese call great nation chauvinism. The Chinese, as I think you well know, have a 5,000 years of history as the political center of Asia. That's what China, Zhongguo, means. They were the center of gravity of culture and of high standards of living throughout East Asia. And that self-conception endures and is part of the drive of contemporary Chinese to establish a leading position in many ways in world affairs. Now, Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai before him were concerned about this, and Deng Xiaoping pursued a policy that we translate as hide and bide. Hide the growing strength of China as a result of its economic development, and bide your time, bide China's time, until it's strong enough to really be much more assertive. And that policy of hide and bide has led Chinese officials and in their approach to the world basically to be sort of diffident, holding back, not being very aggressive in world affairs until very recently. Which is why, as we look at China today, and as I conclude these remarks, why the issue of where China will fit into world affairs, where the China that President Nixon put on the path to normalizing relations not only with us, but the rest of the world, has put us into a period which I like to characterize as a really break point in international affairs. I was a child and a professional during the Cold War period, as I suspect not a few of you in the room were as well. The confrontation, the terrible wars of the 20th century, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. The 20th century was the most violent century in world history. Over 100 million people were killed in these wars and revolutions. Fortunately, as we get into the 21st century, we don't see these great collisions between imperial empires that we saw throughout the 20th century. That's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that there are a whole range of challenges that come in this new era. Economic stability in a world in which our economy is globalized along with China's, everyone else's. The search for energy security to sustain our economies. The issue of nuclear proliferation. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union maintained pretty tight control over nuclear weapons. But with the end of the Cold War and the breakdown of some of the alliances that enabled those controls over nuclear technology to be maintained, that's gone away. And so the challenges we have today dealing with North Korea, with Iran, with Pakistan are a belated and not very effective effort to get nuclear technology, and unfortunately the likelihood of nuclear weapons coming out of that technology as one of our major security challenges. Terrorism, we all know about it. And as I was saying, not trying to spook the students in several of the classes in world affairs we talked to this week, what would have happened if the suicidal guys who took over those aircraft that flew into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 9/11/2001, what would have happened if they had nuclear weapons of whether a dirty bomb or an actual bomb? They were suicidal. They were willing to kill themselves for their purposes. And it's because we see that phenomenon now that the challenge of controlling terrorist groups has become a major issue in our foreign policy. And many of these issues have Chinese involvement in one way or another, certainly in terms of the economic problems that we face today as both China and the United States and lots of other countries worry about jobs, jobs, and jobs, because modernization and technologies like cell phones and the internet have mobilized hundreds of millions of people who might have been passive, or in the case of China, just living as peasants off in isolated little villages. They're now stirred up, and keeping those people employed and happy about Communist Party leadership is the big challenge that the new generation of leaders that will take hold early next year face. So where does that leave us today in the U.S.-China relationship? I think the way to put it is to say that we are neither allies nor enemies. There's a growing element of distrust that grew out of our reaction to Tiananmen and to other things that the Chinese leadership has done as a one-party state. Yet the United States and China are locked into a mutual interdependence, largely based on our economic ties. China fears loss of market access to the United States. They want investment from the U.S., and they are very fearful of the pressures that we put on them for political transparency, for keeping the internet uncensored, for pressure to be responsive on human rights issues, because it is so politically destabilizing. For our part, as I think, again, you're all aware, we are concerned about the degree to which our economy is dependent on the Chinese purchasing our debt. I heard candidate Romney last night commenting on that issue. It's part of our politics these days. We're concerned about China hollowing out our manufacturing base and its use of anti-competitive economic practices. So that, in addition to their unwillingness to cooperate on issues like dealing with Iran or Syria, we have concerns about where China is taking its place into global affairs. So there is a certain drift towards confrontation. between the United States and China. Within the country, there's been a rather lively but not very visible debate about how China should use its dramatic growing power. And there was indication that some people, particularly the Chinese military, wanted to move away from the Deng Xiaoping hide and bide policy and become more aggressive on issues like their territorial claims in the East and South China Seas or the Taiwan issue. And in response, the Obama administration is, as they say, pivoting or rebalancing our military presence in East Asia to try to reassure our longtime allies in the region, the Japanese, the Filipinos, the South Koreans, and friendly states who, irony of irony, who's our biggest friend today in the Asian region? It's the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese have always feared the Chinese, stomping down on them. They had a recent war in the late 70s. The Chinese have used military force to take over areas in the South China Sea that the Vietnamese claim. So suddenly, despite the bitter legacy of the Vietnam War, Vietnam now looks to a more positive relationship with the United States. So in conclusion, how does President Nixon's initiative look with 40 years of retrospect? It clearly benefited us by changing the dynamic of the Cold War to both our benefit and that of China. The Soviets were put on the defensive, and while it wasn't a direct impact, you can say that one of the things that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union was the opening to China, because the Soviet leadership continued to invest and overinvest in their military capacity, seeing the United States, China, and other countries willing to confront them, leading to ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union. President Nixon's initiative ended the Cold War two-front confrontation for us, and for China laid the basis for not only normalizing relations for its economic takeoff, but we don't have a warm and friendly relationship with China today. As Senator John McCain once said to me about negotiation I ran on the Cambodia situation, where we got a very interesting good deal. He said, in politics, no good deed goes unpunished. And in that sense, we look at the relationship with China as having a very two-sided outcome, tremendous benefits, but also laying the basis for what is now a very competitive relationship with the People's Republic of China. A risen China is not an easy partner for the United States. And for those of you who want to spend several long evenings reading Henry Kissinger's most recent book about China, by its history, by having been a regional hegemon, the regional power in East Asia, China has never had easy relations with states of roughly equal size. Its alliance with the Soviet Union collapsed, and during the Cold War, we used to laugh that China's closest ally was Albania. So you had a country of 30 million people as the ally of a country at that point was 700 or 800 million people. The Chinese just don't feel comfortable or haven't worked out what we have experienced in European history of nation states of roughly equal size trying to live together, often not doing it well, as we learned during the 20th century, but nonetheless used to an international system of roughly equal nation states. So today we are sort of drifting potentially towards confrontation with China, which is why my concluding punchline, which I stated at the outset, is one of the great challenges in American foreign policy today is managing this very difficult relationship. It requires building on areas of common interest and trying to dispel the growing distrust in the relationship. It means the United States standing up to China where it gets very pushy, as it has been of late in the South China Sea, and trying to create a working relationship in what you might call a strategic equilibrium, not only in East Asia, but in other areas where the United States and China share common interests, to develop those areas where we do have common interests, but to make it clear that where we and our friends have important interests, we expect those interests to be respected. So President Nixon started quite a process. It was initially enormously beneficial to this country during the Cold War, and the legacy of that initiative today is a very challenging element of our foreign policy. Well, thank you so much for your attention, for coming tonight, and I hope at some further time down the road we can talk, maybe in a decade, about how this relationship is really playing out. Thank you very much.
I want to remind everybody that we are going to have a champagne and dessert reception, and Ambassador Solomon will be signing books which are available for sale in the back. But before that, he's agreed to take a couple of questions, and we have time just for a couple. So if you have a question, can you please just raise your hand, and we do have a microphone. Okay, we have a question, Sean, over there.
Yeah, I was.
Sean, wait.
The question this side. Thank you very much for the speech, by the way. I was curious. I'm trying to figure out which question to ask you.
You only get one.
Yes. All right. The USIP. As you mentioned, I was reading the article in the Quaker paper here. You mentioned it's small and flexible because it's under Congress. In the progressive community, there's at least murmurs of that they'd like to see a Department of Peace, maybe under the executive branch.
Right.
Do you think that the USIP is currently limited in its effectiveness because it's under Congress and might be more effective in the executive branch? Just your thoughts on that, maybe.
Yes, former Congressman Dennis Kucinich has been a big advocate of a Department of Peace. Actually, you can find way back in history a whole range of proposals for a Department of Peace. In our experience, my experience, it's not a good idea for the following reason. If you're part of the big bureaucracy, which part of the government, you lose your standing as a bipartisan, semi-independent operation. Your work becomes both the captive of the politics of that particular administration, and you're more limited or structured in the way that you develop programming, because you're tasked by the Secretary of State, the Secretary of whomever, the President, to do certain things. By being an appendage to Congress, we are bipartisan, and we have the flexibility to initiate programs that otherwise might not be coming out of the heads of people in a given administration. Moreover, the big bureaucracies have come to value our independence. Some of our biggest supporters, ironically, are in the military. Why does the military go to Congress and say, we love the Institute of Peace, keep them in business? It's because our work, if it can prevent a conflict from turning violent, means that the military doesn't have to get involved. We have had offices in Baghdad and Kabul now for almost a decade, where we work the political side of trying to stabilize these countries, and the military loves it, because if we create stability in a certain area, it means that they can go home. Saves money, saves lives. And in addition, I think our quasi-independent status has given us both a credibility of being somewhat or authoritative, but also sufficiently distant from the day-to-day operations of the government so that people who we try to work with in countries around the world, frankly, seem to trust us. And I could give you examples. We've run projects in various parts of Africa and the Philippines, Iraq, Afghanistan, where we're on the ground, and we are appreciated for being somewhat separate from the formal government. So for those reasons, and I've had several long discussions with Mr. Kucinich before he resigned, we thought that we concluded that our effectiveness would not be improved by being part of the government.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the religiosity of China and if there was ever a tilt towards Christianity or Islamic? Because they never talk about religion. I don't know. I assume Buddhist, but does that play in their everyday lives as a government and economics?
Right. Interesting question. How did I get involved in the China business? I mean, totally out of my background. When I was in graduate school, everybody was concerned about the Soviet Union, but I had a terrific professor named Lucian Pai, who was the child of Christian missionaries in China. Lucian Pai had grown up in the country, he had come back and gone to Carleton College, Yale University, and was a university professor at MIT. And one day in 1961, I had taken a course with him and found him just very exciting, attractive. And I said I was debating where to put my energies, what country to maybe specialize in, or what part of the world. And he said, look, everybody and their brother are studying Russian. Why don't you do something a little unusual and something that will have some interesting opportunities associated with it? Learn Chinese. So in the summer of 1961, I had a small scholarship. I went down to Yale for the summer and started studying Chinese. I studied it for 5 years. That's only to say that Christian missionaries were very important to certainly the development of our relations with China. And Lucian Pai's generation, unfortunately, he's died. Another man of that generation who had grown up as a missionary kid in China, Doak Barnett, some others I could name, all came out of that effort of the missionary folks to proselytize in China, to mixed effect. There today is real interest in China and Christianity, both Protestantism and Catholicism. The Chinese Communist Party does not tolerate independent organizations. And so the Catholic community is controlled through what is called a patriotic church, which is subject to political discipline. There are a lot of underground churches in China that are tolerated as long as they don't become too big and too much linked up. There are other religions in China, Buddhism and Islam. And the Chinese have problems dealing with these communities, particularly up in the northwest in Xinjiang province, where Muslim communities really resist control by the Han Chinese. And so religion is an issue of real controversy in China, and again, over time, it will be interesting to see whether the Chinese Communist leadership will gradually find a way to make its peace with these religious movements and allow them to operate in a more open way.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
This is a fairly specific question. It's not very general, but I was just very curious about why in that video where the man is standing in front of the tank, I mean, the suppression of that protest was incredibly brutal and certainly would not have been out of place for the tank to shoot the guy. Was that some kind of decision that was made by the man driving the or was that a result of orders that were given at the time by the government because they knew people were watching?
Should I repeat the question?
No, the question is, why didn't the tank just run over the guy? The leadership and the society were deeply divided about how to deal with the democracy movement, the student movement. And initially, when the leadership tried to suppress the demonstrations, the local troops wouldn't do it. And so ultimately they had to bring troops in from Mongolia and from other parts of the country and give the troops a cock and bull story about how counter-revolutionary people had taken over the Tiananmen Square. And so it did lead to the kind of violence that we're well aware of. What happened at Tiananmen is still a tremendous sore spot, a running sore in Chinese politics. And periodically, well, at the time it was characterized by the leadership as a counter-revolutionary rebellion. That is, the students were out there to try to overthrow the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the students say, no, that wasn't their objective. They just wanted things opened up. And periodically, when this issue does float up in politics, it's suppressed. I would put down money that at some point in the next decade, particularly if a more liberal-minded leadership emerges from the current transition, that you're going to see a reconsideration of what happened in Tiananmen. And the phrase that you'll hear is the call for a reversal of verdicts, that the verdict that this was a counter-revolutionary rebellion will be re-examined and turned out to be just patriotic students who wanted to support the modernization of their society. That has not yet happened, but it's an issue that floats below the surface in Chinese politics.
Ambassador Solomon, thank you again for